Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui, and welcome to this second webinar in our Religious Diversity Centre series, E Tu Te Mana o Te Ao, Building a Climate of Hope. I'm Jocelyn Armstrong, and I've been working with the Religious Diversity Centre Climate Action Group. Last week, we spoke about that understanding, that sustainable and harmonious relationship, that whole sense of connectedness between humanity and the natural world is central to both Indigenous and religious traditions. It's not an abstract ideal, rather it's an actual guide for living justly and walking gently upon the earth. This second webinar is presented by Rabbi Dean Shapiro of the Jewish tradition, and he's supported by the Beth Shalom Synagogue in Auckland. Originally from Los Angeles and living now in Auckland, Rabbi Shapiro is also an adjunct professor at Arizona State University, where he is the director of the Joseph Project. The project offers courses to religious leaders of all faith traditions, equipping them to lead their communities through the challenges of climate change. So greetings, Rabbi Shapiro. The webinar is now in your hands. We're looking forward to your discussion with the three New Zealand scientists, Drs Jim Salinger, Rob Bell, and Alexandra Macmillan, as you discuss together building a climate of hope for our future Aotearoa New Zealand. So thank you, Rabbi.
Jocelyn, thank you very much for the introduction and for welcoming us all and really convening this series of talks along with the Religious Diversity Center. Thank you, Jocelyn and Paul and Richard, our moderator. I think like many people that we are over 150 cameras tonight. I am just barraged by the news. Not a day goes by but that I see multiple articles about fisheries in collapse and slips happening in Northland, about asthma rates and challenges with homes being insured in the future. And it can sometimes just get to be too much. I can get confused and don't know what to do. But one of my great teachers, Ruth Messenger of American Jewish World Service, once teaches that we don't have the luxury of being overwhelmed. So that when we feel it's all too much, we can pause and tend to that, and then we have to get back to work. And so I have been curious, what is the reality of the climate future here in New Zealand? What will life be like here throughout the rest of my expected life, my son's life, and my grandchildren's lives, God willing? And I thought that as we read so many articles here and there, it doesn't actually help, that we need to go to the sources. We need to go to the experts, the people who have done the research and really understand what life will be like here on the ground in 2050, 2075, 2100, so that we can be educated citizens and residents and members of communities, so that we can make good decisions for ourselves, for our communities, and for our country. And that is what we intend to do tonight, as we hear from three speakers, each expert in their field. As they begin, I'm just going to share something really lovely that the Religious Diversity Center is doing, and that is we are collecting koha for charities, trusts that are doing good work for the environment. Our three speakers have each nominated one, and those names will go into the chat as well as links. So if you are inspired, if you are appreciated, perhaps you'll give some money so that tonight we not only educate ourselves, but we actually equip the people who are doing the work on the front lines of our country. And with that, I want to have us begin, and I'll start by introducing Dr. Jim Salinger, who I know is known to many of you. He is a noted international climate scientist whose achievements include the first detection of global warming in 1976, leading the Southern Hemisphere research on climate change, and being awarded the New Zealand Science Technology Medal from the Royal Society of New Zealand in 1994. He's a prolific communicator on climate change, credited with at least 190 publications, and he has a list of organizations and achievements and awards as long as your arm, but which could be possibly be more august than being a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which collectively was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change. So, Jim, I am grateful to know you, to that you are a member of my Beth Shalom community, and that you're here tonight to be our teacher.
Thank you, Dean. Well, unfortunately, you're not going to see me because I'm in Tivoli in Italy, and unfortunately, my screen has frozen. So you're going to see the Remarkables, which is near where I live, and I will point out the significance of that sort of later in my talk. But firstly, I just want to talk about future challenges in New Zealand region climate, impacts on glaciers, agriculture, and fisheries. So if we can have the next image, please, Dean. Dean has to drive it for me. So, and just press it once again, and I think, and again, one more time. Right. So when we think of the New Zealand area, it's actually a huge area. There's the exclusive economic zone is 15 times the land area, 4 million square kilometres. So we're responsible for the 5th largest exclusive economic zone in the world. So that's what I mean when we talk about the New Zealand area. And I'll be talking about what's happening in the blue box, which surrounds our country. The land area is only a 15th. So we're quite unusual in having more marine area and less land area. So going to the next slide, we will see what's been happening, or what's going to happen. So this is really various model projections of what, depending on whether lots of more carbon dioxide and methane, they're the most potent greenhouse gases, are released. If you have a look around 2050, you'll find that warming is somewhere between 0.5 to 1.5 degrees above what it used to be. If you go to 2075, we're looking at the range is about 0.8 to almost 2 degrees. You go out to 2100, and we're looking at a range from about 1 degree right up to 3.5 degrees. So that's a huge change, and that's going to be determined by human behaviour. And on all 3 of these states, there will be many more days exceeding 30 degrees, particularly in inland areas in the north of the country, and hardly any frosts. So moving on to the next slide, just pause while Dean catches up. This is depending on when you were born. If you're like me, born about 1950, we have seen about 1 degree of warming. So you can see this measures the intensity of warming. If you were born about 1980, so that's Gen X's, when they're 70 years old, they will have seen probably 2 degrees of warming. And those who are born now are going to see, if we continue on the current projection, they will see about 3 degrees, maybe more of warming, which will be, if that comes to pass, the world will be completely different and the choices now than we face. So it behoves us, and we should really be deferring back to the people who are, I call them Zoomers, not Boomers, who are in their 20s, for taking action, which they are. Moving on to the next slide, we see, so what happens? Well, you see there's a lot of warming, but the biggest change is in what happens with rainfall. And we saw it this year, the Auckland anniversary weekend floods, where 400 millimetres of rain happened in a very short, in one day, which is huge. And then Cyclone Gabrielle floods, and basically you warm up the atmosphere. Every degree it warms, there's 7% more water in the atmosphere, and down it comes. So the biggest threat to New Zealand is, apart from sea level rise and inundation from the marine environment, which Rob will be talking about, is flooding. In the 1870s, the New Zealand death was simply when the explorers and others crossing waterways were taken out by floods, and that was known as the New Zealand death. We have very steep waterways, and so when it rains, whoosh, it all comes down very quickly. Moving on to the next slide. Here it comes. This, we're known as Aotearoa. This is a painting done of Peter's Pond of the Franz Josef Glacier in the 1890s. And we'll look at the next image, and that's it in 2018. Well, I think you can notice a huge difference. It's now Peter's Pond, full of water, and the Franz Josef Glacier is probably, if you look at the V of the two valleys, it's somewhere way up there. So this is a huge amount of glacier ice loss we've seen in the last century or more. And if we look, just push the, yes, we've lost half of the Southern Alps glacier ice volume lost in the last 70 years. So we used to have about 60 cubic kilometres. We're now down to about 30 cubic kilometres of permanent glacier ice volume in our Southern Alps. So the relevance of showing you the remarkables is Aotearoa is fast becoming Aotearoa. The land of the long white cloud is going to the land of the short white cloud. Moving on to the next slide. So glaciers are very helpful for us. There are three significant parts of assistance they give. They provide drinking water, irrigating crops, and help to generate hydroelectric power. So glaciers also provide water to the various ecosystems, as this is the reservoir of water. So once the snow melt has been melted and run off, then what you're left is glacier melt. But as temperatures are increasing, so there is no other way to reduce this rapid melting rate. The only way is to control the temperature and take strict actions against this. Well, this is quite difficult to do. We'll move on to the next slide. How am I for time, Dean? Can't hear you.
Hi, Jim. You have about 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. That's plenty of time.
In that case, you have 5 minutes.
Cutting me back, eh? Warmer temperatures, extreme weather events will generally have negative impacts on livestock productivity and welfare. What happens when it's warmer? This is where the insect vectors get busy, and you have ticks and things that bite excuse the noise outside, we'll get a door closed. This is local noise of internal combustion engines. Now, so there's ticks and other insect pests and diseases, and they really provide a nuisance to livestock. It's also, as it gets hotter, grasses dry out and you don't get so much productivity. Pasture growth rates may be affected, so land may suffer increased erosion due to heavy precipitation events. What is not commonly known is you get more productivity, grass productivity in Southland in the summer than you do in, say, the Waikato, because temperatures are cooler, so the grasses don't rush to maturity and seeding as they do, and therefore you get more biomass productivity. In Waikato, they rush to maturity and you don't get so much biomass. Changing temperature and rainfall patterns may increase winter yields of some crops, but reduce the yields of others reliant on winter chill. A classic case is kiwi fruit, and you've probably seen failure in Northland of kiwi fruit because they don't get the chilling required, which synchronizes the flowering, so it's all over the place. So kiwi fruit is no longer, for example, a viable crop in Northland. And an overall decline in crop yield and quality is expected with rising temperatures because of the effect that I've described between Southland and the Waikato. So moving on to the next slide, fisheries. There's been some modelling done on what happens to various fisheries by scientists, and basically fisheries aren't like animals and paddocks. They can move around, and they do so. And for example, I live in Queenstown, and we were getting, would you believe, snapper in Queenstown, which had been fished off the west coast of the South Island. Well, that's not the normal range that you expect to see snapper in. So you can see the models with warming, the various fisheries move, and that then destroys quota, because the quota are based on current climate. In terms of shellfish and other, there's been bleaching of shellfish in the fjords and seaweeds around the southern coast because of the marine heat waves we've been having. In terms of what they're used to, they've been destroyed in some cases. Moving on to the next slide. So what do we need to do about it? Well, firstly, going to talk about mitigation. And there's a whole list there, 10 things: retire coal plants, increase public transport and biking and walking. This is called active transport. Actually, it's very good for you because it keeps you fit. Invest in clean energy, decarbonise, particularly aviation and shipping, retrofit and decarbonise buildings. There's huge opportunities there. You can have curtains as a minimum, but double glazing and all sorts. Halt deforestation and restore degraded lands. Then there's reduce food loss and water and improve agriculture practice. This is a big one, and we keep ducking in New Zealand in this country. Unfortunately, I won't be popular for saying this, but the agricultural community think they're entitled to produce more greenhouse gases, and they argue, oh, well, the country lives off us, we don't have to do anything. Well, I'm afraid that's a very selfish attitude, and they need to change. There's shift to electric vehicles and eat more plants and less meat, which is happening globally, and that's where our agriculture industry needs to take note. And finally, there's adaptation. If we go to the last slide, and there's a number of things. Reforestation is very important. And then there's river restoration, wetland restoration, protect and expand natural, semi-natural areas, natural fire regime restoration. I like particularly nature-based solutions because they're natural. And there's a lot you can do in agriculture, from having mixed livestock and cropping to biochar production, where you lock up the carbon, etc. And I think, Dean, that is my last slide, and I should perhaps be on time.
Beautifully done, Jim. Thank you so much. My head is full of ideas and questions, and we are going to save questions until all three experts have spoken, and then we'll get a chance to have some conversation. So thank you, Jim. It's now my honor to introduce Rob Bell. He has 42 years experience in coastal engineering, risk from coastal hazards, the impact of climate change on coastal communities and infrastructure, and how we can plan adaptively for climate adaptation. And through his consultancy, Bell Adapt, he is working with local communities and government to assess climate risk and what to do about it, including managed retreat. He also teaches a planning course at Waikato University. So Rob, thank you for being with us tonight. Over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rob Bell tōko ingoa. So as Dean has said, I've got this background in engineering. So climate change is a complex problem, and it's going to get more complex. And so engineers, we're taught to look at these complex problems and address them and look at some of the potential solutions. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we face adapting to climate change in coastal areas and also the floodplains of Aotearoa. So we've certainly seen this year, but it's been building up over the last decade or so, the emergence of what I call compound hazards, where thing hazards are combining together. So on the top left, we've got groundwater rise and salinity intrusion. So we're seeing a number of areas around estuaries in the North Island, particularly where grasses are dying off because there's more saline water riding on the back of sea level rise. That's a hole we dug in South Dunedin, so the groundwater is fairly close to the surface at times there. Then we're all familiar with intense rainfall and storms, which Jim has talked about. So more flash flooding and landslips. And here's a shot of Riverhead during a February thunderstorm. We're also seeing environmental impacts from cumulative changes, more sediment coming down in heavy storms, a lot of landsliding providing sediments to estuaries. So we're seeing a lot of cumulative changes in our environmental systems. And then the big one that I'm mostly work with is sea level rise, which is being driven by warming of the oceans, but also losses from the polar ice sheets. And certainly there's a tipping point around 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, where the polar ice sheets will become essentially unstable, and we'll see sea level rise ongoing for centuries. So just a little shot from NASA, 10 centimeters or so in the last 30 years, maybe 0.3 meters by 2050. And then by 2100, as Dan said, let's look out various time. We're looking anywhere between 0.4 and 1 meter sea level rise, depending on how emissions track, and Jim's covered that as well. Jim's also talked about the rainfall intensity. So, it doesn't hurt to keep talking about this, because this is a biggie in terms of flooding. So for every increase in 1 degrees Celsius of warming, for those 1 hour durations, where we see the type of situation in the photo there, we're going to see between 12 and 19% increase and those 1 hour duration at high intensity rainfalls. So we're going to see significant challenges for our stormwater network and our stock banks that hold the river floods in, because they're all based on past rainfall data. And as a lot of people know and are realizing quite quickly, our rainfall is changing. When we go to the coast, we're seeing a changing frequency of coastal flooding. So traditionally, we've built houses that were just above the 1 in a century flood. This is a coastal flood. So the mean sea level, and it's up at the sort of 1 in 100 year type event. That's the recent past. However, if you ratchet up sea level, and so sea level has risen 20 centimeters since 1900, and it keeps going up, it means so some of the work I've been doing is what sea level rise is required where a very rare 1 in 100 years or 1 in a century type coastal flood would become something that occurs annually on average every year. And that's a fairly modest sea level rise of between 0.27 and 0.42 meters of sea level rise. And so one of the Horizons deans asked us to look at around the 2050s, around that mark, we're going to see something that was very rare, like Tamaki Drive and other low-lying parts of the coast around New Zealand, those kind of rare floods becoming something that essentially happens every year. So in some places we're seeing in New Zealand, they're very close to what we call adaptation thresholds. So there's a shot of Gisborne in the February Cyclone Gabrielle. We've got South Dunedin that happened a few years ago, and that's a compound hazard where we've got rainfall, stormwater runoff, and the drain stormwater system not able to cope, and high groundwater levels. And then we've got the common one that we used to talk about a lot in Holmaiana and the Hawke's Bay. I've done quite a bit of work there, where some of the houses are not at the coast, they're actually on the beach. And then just to top it all off, even on a sunny day, we're seeing flooding on king tides. And that's when we like to buy a property. We look at these idyllic scenes and we think, you know, this sits right on the water's edge and offers all day sun, so why don't we buy it? So these are areas that are at adaptation thresholds where we've got to do something about it. Jim's talk about adaptation and mitigation, so they go hand in hand. So I've got a little bit of a system here. We've got polar ice sheets and glaciers. We've got the oceans. So as things warm up, they take a long time to respond and warm up. And then eventually sea level rises. So like the bathtub, which is the coastal floods and the river floods where we're continually mopping up, we can't just turn the tap off on the bathtub, because if we start to reduce this, it's going to take a very long time to work through the system, particularly through the polar ice sheets and the ocean. So the greenhouse gases we're emitting today are going to show up in sea level rise in the next several decades. So there's change ahead. So for disaster risk reduction in the past, we've sort of focused on, well, let's reduce the impact of the really major events, and then we'll be able to get back to normal and bounce back quicker. But climate adaptation is much more complex because it's focused on not just those major events, which we're used to civil defence emergency management arrangements responding to, but we're going to see ongoing gradual change. So sea level gradually becoming more wetland, pasture becoming salt grass, and so on. And then we're going to see more frequent nuisance events, as I've mentioned. So change is really the new norm. So we have to work our way around this, as well as, on the other hand, reduce our emissions. So we need a new way to manage changing risks. So we have to ask ourselves the question, do we continually react, clean up and stay put? Or do we protect assets and hunker down? Or do we anticipate, adapt and avoid some of those hazards that are coming, particularly on floodplains and coastal areas? So can we be more adaptive before too much damage occurs? Can we put in timely investment, but not too soon, but not too late? That's the Goldilocks principle. And land use planning, which I'll talk about in a minute, putting brakes on developing hazard-prone land. So what can we do about it? Well, there's essentially 4 things we can do. We can accommodate and work around floods and sea level rise by raising floor levels or raising the road or putting the house back further on the section and setting minimum floor levels. So I've been working with councils, coming up with policies around doing that. The second one, which is unfortunately the go-to option for most communities, let's put a seawall up or some groins or beach nourishment. So here's an example at Cook's Beach, where essentially you have a negative environmental effect of such structures where you lose your high tide beach. So yes, you can protect the houses, but you might not be able to walk along the beach at high tide. The third option is to avoid the hazard risk, so through land use planning. So let's not build in low-lying areas that are more likely to get flooding. And so that's a focus of the attention of a lot of councils following Cyclone Gabrielle. So we need to avoid this sort of situation. A shot from Waihi Beach, brand new house, right up close to the beach. So we've got to put the brakes on doing this kind of development. And then finally, the one I'll just spend a couple of slides on, managed retreat, where we take people and relocate them and their assets away from the risk. So managed retreat, as you know, it's become quite topical after Cyclone Gabrielle, but it's hard yakka anywhere we do it. So just some points here. Property owners in iwi hapu have really strong place attachments, and so it's going to be difficult to move people somewhere else where it meets their well-being needs. And it's a particularly fertile ground for ethical issues and inequities, and I'll just touch on that shortly. It's primarily a socio-political and a moral issue, not necessarily a technocratic or an engineering solution, so it can be quite a fraught process. And we have to maybe change the perception a little bit, and I saw this in Hawke's Bay, rather than just focusing on moving people out of harm's way, how can we provide opportunities to address equity issues and to move them to a place where that's somewhere better. But it is going to be hard in urban settings like Auckland, where you've got high density, so the managed retreat's probably going to be a bit more dispersive. But it does provide an opportunity to provide a bit more coastal reserves where they're going to get squeezed by sea level rise. So we are making progress towards a national framework for managed retreat, but it's not new. So we've got research from different areas around the country, like the Christchurch red zones, Matata debris slide, where managed retreat was undertaken in. One of the areas managed retreat was done in the 1980, when I started work, was in Kelso in Otago. They had 2 floods in a row, 2 100-year floods within 2 years. In 1978, that's the cartoon, and 1980. And so 1 year later, they finally came to an arrangement to move houses. So it takes time. But it's sort of playing through now after Cyclone Gabrielle, but it's not anything necessarily new. Mātauranga Māori knowledge, they have a long history of adapting to change and relocating, so we can learn a lot from them. And I just provided some really nubby issues that are currently being discussed with the resource management reform, particularly around who pays, who gets compensated, how much is it capped, how do we minimise moral hazard. So just some personal reflections before I finish up. So as a Christian, being involved in this work, it really motivates me, particularly when I'm engaging with the public, and I really enjoy public meetings, really particularly the one-on-ones where you talk about and raise the awareness of the issues for their area. But I've seen a number of people talk to them one-on-one afterwards in tears because of climate stress. They think sea level rise is very imminent for their property. They're really worried, concerned, just almost like a grief thing. So that's the part I really enjoy, because I'm an empathetic person, working with them. And in most cases, a lot of them are not going to see the impacts of, for instance, sea level rise for maybe 50 or 60 years, others sooner, but a lot of them well down the track. And then they go away feeling very relieved, because they've had their eyes open to what's real, what's happening, and how long they might have. So that's some, but the other issues around equity, I'm really keen on helping councils and government around making sure we've got equity processes in place for things like managed retreat. So just in summary, the focus has to be on both reducing emissions and adaptation. We've got to do both hand in hand. And we need adaptation in low-lying areas. That's for certain, whether it's floodplains or coastal low-lying areas, it's for certain we're going to have to do some adaptation. The uncertainty is when we have to do it, just as I've been describing with some of the people I've been talking with, and how fast that might happen. Managed retreat is complex, it's hard yakka, but it has to be faced and funded, and the side effects addressed. So the statutory framework that's been worked on, including the compensation, funding and model, is coming, but it needs a lot of work to minimise inequities, and it has to be seen to be fair. And a lot of people ask me the question, well, how optimistic am I? Am I an optimist in terms of climate change, and particularly around the coast where I work? And I think it's probably not the right question. It's not the right word. To me, work on climate change needs real courage to provide leadership, to make hard decisions about avoiding risk and harm to people, and not enhancing any further, or not damaging any further some of the inequities in our society. So essentially, it's not a technocratic issue that I deal with. I take the Māori proverb, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It's the people that matter. So thank you.
Dr. Bell, thank you very much. A lot of what you said is going to stay with me, especially the call to have courage. I know that that those words are going to ring in my ears and in my heart for a long time to come. So thank you for all that information and also for that boost. It's now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to Dr. Alex Macmillan, who is a public health physician and associate professor in environmental health at Te Whare Wananya o Atakau. She co-directs Climate Health Aotearoa, which is a new national climate change and health research center. Her research focuses on the health and health equity effects of climate change itself, and how we design health equity-centered policy options to reduce our climate pollution and ensure that we are well prepared for the health risks we've already locked in. Dr. Macmillan.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Dean. He tangata teratio no te whenua moemoea me tāmaki makaurau hau ko Ōtepoti te kāinga inai under the umbrella of Kaitahu here in Dunedin. And I'm going to be speaking about climate change and people's health and well-being and health injustices but also opportunities for improving health and fairness through climate action. And because climate change is such a huge and complex public health threat that's going to dwarf COVID in scale and cost. And as a public health person, I have this ethical impetus to protect and improve community health through collective action of society, and especially acting on the building blocks of health, things like a safe climate, with health and social equity and te tiriti at the heart. So globally, climate change is an increasing and important public health threat that's largely about making existing threats to health worse, with really complex pathways between the things that you've already heard about, rising temperatures and problems of heat, and more extreme weather events, rising sea levels and ocean acidification, having flow-on effects across a whole range of different building blocks of health, including food and water and allergens and the way that diseases are spread around the globe, and things like the direct effects of severe weather like heat and floods and injuries and things like that. Some of this constellation of effects, some of them are close, they're direct, they're easy to attribute to climate change, like heat waves and storm injuries, and the range extension of tropical diseases like malaria and dengue. And others have a much longer causal chain, they're more indirect, like flow-on effects on food supply chains, like conflict and migration, like the effects on housing. And they're much harder to directly attribute to climate change, but they may also be more important in the early to mid-term. And what things are going to look like in 2050 or 2100 is extremely highly dependent on the pathways that we choose to close the gaping hole in our waka, in our ship, by reducing our climate pollution, as well as the things we choose to do to bail it out. In other words, those adaptation actions, so the things that society does to support people through the locked-in changes that are already starting to be with us. But I want to make really clear that just bailing out the waka is not going to be enough to protect health and health equity from climate change, and that there are huge limits to humans and the ecosystems that we depend on to adaptation. And so this is a recent, really awesome data visualization in the Berlin Morning Post, the Morgen Post, that maps where the world will be uninhabitable by 2100 under current trajectories of 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, with demonstrating how issues of heat and sea level rise and loss of sources of fresh and drinking water will really cause human physiological limits to adaptation and force people to move and migrate, and that such mass migration has a high risk of ungovernability, with large amounts of internal and international migration leading to conflict. And we've seen this already to some extent, the ways that climate change has played a part, had a fingerprint in things like the Syrian civil war. Like the global picture, health effects are really highly dependent on every 10th of a degree of warming, as well as all our societal efforts to respond to that, and that they'll change over time. But 4 early effects are already with us and really important. Firstly, the effects on mental health that Rob has already really poignantly illustrated in his personal interactions with people. And we know that we can see the outcomes of the effects on mental health on young people in terms of their willingness to leave school and have mass protests around their concerns and fears around climate change. But also that severe weather events and droughts and flooding are already impacting, and sea level, ocean acidification are already affecting livelihoods, especially primary industry livelihoods, things like farming and fisheries, as Jim mentioned, and that these also have effects on mental health of people like farmers. And those effects include a term called solastalgia, which is about the grief that comes with the changes to place whilst living in that place and having a strong connection to place. That fresh and drinking water contamination are going to increasingly be a problem on an existing base of a freshwater crisis in Aotearoa, and that severe weather, again, had played a part in the recent extreme drinking water outbreak of Campylobacter in Havelock North that affected over 5,000 people. That flooding and sea level rise effects on housing are going to be really critical. And again, Rob has already mentioned this, and that we're already seeing this occurring in New Zealand, especially with the recent flooding in Cyclone Gabriel, and that housing is a critical building block of health, and that we already have an existing housing and health crisis that causes deaths and thousands of hospitalizations in New Zealand each year from heart and respiratory disease and from asthma in children, as well as lost days off school and days off work. So there are huge justice issues here for health. Climate change is already worsening existing social and health inequities that are driven by societal decisions and structures. And for Māori, there are these really strong interlinkages between climate change effects and colonization effects, meaning that climate change is another breach of ongoing breaches of te tiriti, particularly in terms of intersecting land theft and ongoing other effects of colonization. And that these effects are all interrelated with problematic feedback between them. Another really, really important effect that's already being seen in Aotearoa and globally is effects on food supply and on nutrition. And this is a recent sign from our local countdown in Dunedin, just demonstrating that Cyclone Gabriel has had these effects on food supply locally in Aotearoa that have pushed up the price of food, as well as affecting the availability of food in our supermarkets. The Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health provides a global assessment of the effects of climate change, and much of its effects are already seen through food insecurity. So from 1981 to 2019, the truly essential land food crop yield potentials for maize, winter wheat, soy, and rice has had a consistently downward trend, with reductions of around 6% for maize, 2% for winter wheat, nearly 5% for soy, and 2% for rice, and that these will continue to decline. So there are these international pressures on essential food that Aotearoa imports as well. And the prices of these essentials we know are already high, resulting in huge nutritional inequities by income and ethnicity, and food security already for 1 in 5 of our children. And that was before COVID impacted on food prices. Jim has already talked about the effects on our fisheries and shellfish, but all kinds of food production is affected by changes in rainfall and severe weather events, with particularly important effects on Māori rights to healthy kai, and specifically to mahinga kai, which is wild sourced food. And there are really important regional effects. New Zealand is part of the Pacific, and the Western Pacific is set to be worst hit by malnutrition deaths as a result of climate change. So this graph just shows some projected effects on different elements of food-related health outcomes by 2050 under high emission scenarios, which is what we're heading for. With globally around 600,000 additional deaths in 2050, but most of these and the highest burden being felt in the Western Pacific region, in other words, amongst our Pacific neighbours. And around 80% of all Pacific people still rely on agricultural produce from their own gardens to supplement their diets. And we know that the problem of food is not one of production, but rather what we're choosing to grow and the way that we're using human food crops to feed livestock and the way that food is distributed. That's already causing a massive problem of hunger and food insecurity. In both cities and rural areas, there are these complex intersections between land use and water and housing and health that are really important. And these were really strongly exposed with Cyclone Gabriel, where market-led land uses were intersected with the severe weather event to create immediate trauma with mental and physical health harm, including 11 deaths from drowning, and then waterborne infectious diseases, contaminated mahinga kai and shellfish, displacement and loss of housing, loss of access to health services and other building blocks of health. That these effects are already on us calls for a health and health equity centred response, because reacting to and recovering from increasingly frequent severe weather events is really costly and comes with its own potential co-harms and injustices. So every dollar we spend on recovery has to do quadruple duty. So every dollar we spend on responding and adapting must also be a dollar that we're spending on mitigation and reducing our climate impacts. It has to be a dollar that we're spending on resilience. It has to be a dollar that we're spending on improving health and reducing health inequities. And it needs to be a dollar spent on reorienting our long-term relationships with land and water that includes addressing the market barriers to making this shift. So the slash that you see in this picture is a direct result of market drivers of land use change from native forest to livestock farming to plantation forestry. And we are going to have to address that market-driven land use governance if we're going to have a healthy and equitable response to climate change. And when it comes to identifying and implementing solutions to these complex problems, linking climate change, water, land, and health, we're very far from this integrated, holistic approach in our current policy settings. So we have this tendency at the moment to look for technological single focus interventions to respond to our climate pollution. And that includes things like electric vehicles as a response to our transport emissions, and vaccinations and low emissions feeds for our dairy cattle in response to our agricultural emissions, while ignoring the bigger picture, the bigger complex intersecting picture of land, water, housing and health and climate. And missing out really on win-wins for climate and health equity that come from the sorts of te tiriti partnership-based land governance models that really address our relationship with land and water and biodiversity, like this example on the right of te whakaoranga o te puhenui, the revitalisation of the Puhonui stream, bringing it out of a stormwater drain, and in partnership with Mana Whenua, recreating a resilient, healthy adaptation response to flooding in Tamaki Makaurau. So carefully designed climate action with health equity at the centre represents a really exciting and positive opportunity for addressing many of our biggest current health problems. And we've got a really good understanding of what these win-wins or multi-solving actions are across all the sectors that need to drastically reduce their emissions. And Jim mentioned a couple of these already, particularly the one about active transport in the transport sector. So getting people out of their cars and onto biking, walking and wheelchair use to get around in cities especially. In the land, water, climate intersecting space, we have to think about our food system, and Jim mentioned this as well, that there are huge opportunities but from changing our food production system towards more plant-based, resilient food production with low inputs, as well as our diet towards a more plant-based diet. And what we know from our own New Zealand research is that every shift we make towards a more plant-based diet in Aotearoa comes not just with climate and water, fresh water and land use benefits, but also huge benefits to health, where we can save more than $10 billion in health costs over the life of the current adult population. If I was still a hospital doctor, I'd be considered negligent if a patient was admitted with a temperature and I treated that with some Panadol without looking at other signs and symptoms to get at the underlying cause and diagnosis. And what these land-water climate intersection that I've talked about demonstrate is the message that Jocelyn gave us at the start, that climate change is just one symptom of a broken relationship with nature as a result of an extractive economy that in the end is hitting some limits in whether or not it can continue to improve our life expectancy and our quality of life, and particularly problematic for health equity. So a more fundamental treatment is needed than just addressing climate change on its own, and that understands that economic prosperity is just one of the fundamental building blocks of health, with no point on its own except to improve quality of life, and that can't happen if we stuff up these critical life support systems. And increasingly in public health, we're also understanding that this broken economic model has also meant an increasing imbalance of power, where corporations are able to block life-saving policies, and that includes climate change policies. The latest IPCC report made more than 25 mentions of the role of fossil fuel and agricultural corporations in holding back government action on climate change. And the very conservative leading international medical journal, The Lancet, last month launched a new commission on the commercial determinants of health with this statement, calling for new approaches to rebalancing power in the interests of public and planetary health. Which leads me to some take-home messages from the large amount of ground that I've covered this evening. We need relational systems approaches to land and water healing, and we can't do that healthily and equitably without putting Te Tiriti partnership at the centre. The health effects of climate change are already here and accelerating with worsening injustices, but we also have this huge opportunity for multi-solving climate and health with systems thinking and centering mātauranga Māori for a deeper land and water healing process. And that it's clear what the systemic processes look like to achieve that. And we know largely the effective actions that are needed, and that the barriers now are really about commercial influences blocking good policy, and public health knowledge and action can help with the rebalancing of power that's needed there. Kia ora. Ngā mihi nunui ki a koutou, and I'll look forward to questions and discussion.
Part of me wants to say thank you, doctor, and part of me does not want to say thank you, because that was a lot of negative, a lot of negative pressures on health outcomes. And so if I may direct the first question to you, given what you just painted, are you able to compare New Zealand health outcomes in the future to those elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and great question. Thanks, Rabbi. I think that what's most exciting is that places that are already putting health and health equity at the heart of climate action are starting to see the health benefits of doing that. And we can see that in cities that were really car dominant, for example, like cities like Paris, that have had a really rapid shift in direction towards more walking and biking and public transport and wheelchair use, and really seeing health benefits of that, including things like improved air pollution and a happier population and fairer access to the building blocks of health. So that's one thing. Secondly, we've got a huge amount of capacity for addressing this problem. We're a small, high-income country with open government, and on a global scale, when we compare countries, low levels of corruption. But as I said, we're not without commercial interests on policy, and we do need to grapple with that. So we've got a high amount of capacity for addressing climate change, and it's people like us coming together in movements to press government that is going to make the difference.
Thank you. We are going to take about 10, maybe 15 minutes to continue with questions now. The next question I'd like to ask, I'm going to put to all three panelists, and it is this. It has a part A and a part B for each of you. And that is, if you could change a practice and if you could change a policy here in New Zealand, or change a practice and implement a policy, what would you do? What would be at the top of your list? Let's start with Rob.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I go back to the comment I made in my talk around we can do a lot of avoiding some of these land, water, extreme event kind of intersections that Alex has talked about. And so I showed you the building in Waihi Beach. It's just a bellwether of what's going around the country. And so I've just finished some guidance for the Ministry for the Environment around helping councils make wise decisions about where they build on hazard-prone land. But unfortunately, and I've seen it in action, and Alex touched on it, there are vested interests out there, particularly in the developers world, real estate agents, but particularly developers and big companies who put pressure on councils to weaken and create permitted activities, when in fact some of those things we should have courage to be able to implement through councils prohibited activities, but it's seldom done. So I'd like to see that happen more often, where we have the courage to say this is not a good place to build. And I think maybe we can build on that from the aftermath of Gabrielle.
Thank you. Jim, if you could implement one shift in practice or cultural change and one policy, what would it be?
Right. Well, the practice I'd shift is ban parents driving their kids to school. I mean, if you look at the urban areas, when we were young, I shouldn't say it, we all walked to school, and in Dunedin, if it snowed, my mother never took me to school. So, in other words, encourage active transport Don't allow any parking around schools. You have to start young, get them out on their bikes in the Queenstown Lakes areas. There's a very good cycleway network. Yet all these kids either drive to school or the parents drop them off. Why? This way you're encouraging fitness from a young age. Policy, right. We've got to actually basically increase, well, just replace fossil fuel, electricity from fossil fuel production, and we can do it very quickly with renewables. Look at, I've just been in the Californian desert and the Arizona desert, lots of wind power everywhere and lots of solar farms. And Texas produces more renewable energy than California. So if they can do it, we can.
Thank you. Arizona and California, my home states, and to you, Alex.
Yes, well, I could say all sorts of things, but riffing off from the end of my presentation, I think that the change in practice that's needed for people is to, while acknowledging that individual action is a good thing, to really see what the structural barriers are to change, and to begin to shift from a sense of individual guilt about not being able to be a perfect, sustainable person, to really putting the responsibility where it lies, and they're on the industries that have held back government action for so long. And so to begin to collectively call for those industries to be shut out of climate policy making. So that's the practice one. The policy one is to follow the public health action on tobacco, and to have a similar global statement in the UNFCCC, that's the Global Climate Change Treaty, to the UN Global Treaty on Tobacco, which says that tobacco policy must be made without the involvement of the tobacco industry. So that's what's in the global treaty. We need a statement like that in the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Treaty.
Thank you. Being aware of the time, I'm a little afraid to ask this question, but I'm going to do it anyway, because it's one that people have asked me as I've preached about climate and the natural world over these last years. And that is, given the realities that you have described, how baked in are these negative outcomes? Or how much can our actions as individuals, as families, and as communities make a difference in what's coming down the pike? Whoever wants. Alex, you're nodding, so I'll ask you in first.
Well, I think I mentioned this a few times in my talk, that every 1/10 of a degree matters hugely, and the choices that society makes to respond to the locked-in changes really matter as well. And so that, I think, gives us huge opportunities to make change happen in ways that are collective. And I think that I've already shown the importance of politically oriented action. And I think that's crucially important, that people don't feel alone, that they come together and that they take political action together, because every 1/10 of a degree matters and every choice we make matters.
Thank you, Jim.
Yes, well, I go back to Mahatma Gandhi, where he says, it's not what you do, it's not what you think, it's what you do. And I could take the action, well, I don't need to pay taxes in New Zealand because my not paying taxes won't do anything. But it's Alex's point. it's like cars globally. You need to take action. Every bit helps.
Thank you. And Rob.
Yeah, so in the coastal space, it's a very special case of adaptation because there seems to, well, there's a lot of bad news. It's essentially, we've already baked in 1 metre of sea level rise from past emissions of our parents and our grandparents, etc. And so there's this long delay that I've talked about. So even if we keep global temperatures to 2 degrees, we're still going to face 1 metre. And so, and it's going to go on for centuries. But the other side of the story is, if we don't mitigate our greenhouse gases, then that 1 metre is going to turn up towards the end of this century or very early next century. But if we do mitigate and get down to 2 degrees, that 1 metre might not turn up for 2 centuries or more. So it buys us a lot of time to adapt very slowly. But if we don't mitigate, we're going to have to relocate out of low-lying coastal areas. We're going to have to speed up adaptation. As I said, we're going to have higher frequency of coastal flooding in the next few decades. And so if we don't mitigate, we're going to have those problems to deal with in an urgent, fast pace, rather than slowly considering what are our options and how do we keep those equity issues alive rather than just panic and knee-jerk reactions and reactive responses.
Thank you. There are some questions coming in, not many, but some. And the questions that I'm asking of the panelists are some of those questions put into my own words. And I've gotten a few questions about the role of religious organizations. And I'd like to speak to that just briefly. One is that as communities, religious communities, ethnic communities, we sit somewhere between the individual and the family and the overarching society. We are a place where one individual can shift a substantial group of people, whether towards political action or to adaptation, to learning, to finding solutions, to supporting one another and building systems. And for me, that is a powerfully important step, piece of this whole puzzle. It's not so much the focus of this panel, given that we have scientists and engineers here with us, but it is the work of the Religious Diversity Center. And Jocelyn, perhaps we can talk about more ways to engage with that work. However, that's the perfect way for me to segue. I'm going to segue to Jim, who wanted to present a Jewish perspective, and then Alex, and then I'll conclude. Jim.
Thank you, Dean. Well, I did a paper way back in time with Rabbi Patty Kopstein, a predecessor of yours, and we looked at global warming from a Jewish perspective. And Judaism, it's one of the 3 Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It sees humans as, seem to have lost some page there.
Jim, I just started sharing my screen. We weren't able to name the 3 organizations and put them in the chat, so this way people can see the 3 that you 3 have nominated and considering making Koha.
Right. No, I just wondered what was happening. Okay, so Judaism sees humans as part of nature, not above nature, and I think, or creation, whichever way you want to look at it. And there were 2 important things. There's Tikkun Olam, which is repair the world, and the other thing is to have a rest, which is the Sabbath. So the idea of the Sabbath was to take a break on everything that had been done and have a look and make sure that everything is running sweetly. Then Tika Olam is we have a duty to repair the world for ourselves and future generations. So that is very strong. It's very much like Matarangi Maori. It's quite ecocentric. It doesn't put humans above everybody. We're just part of it all. So that's really what I'd like to explain, and that we've made a mess of the world, now we need to repair it. And a colleague of yours, Rabbi Ed, heads that Tikkun Olam up in the US.
Absolutely. It is a call for all of us active Jews. I'll just highlight, Jim, what you said about the Sabbath, Shabbat, as a concept, as a technology. If we think about it as one day a week off, well, that's harder for us. But if we thought about dialing back industry consumption by 1/7, think of what a powerful impact that would have. And it is, in fact, the same concept. Dr. Macmillan, and then we'll conclude.
I think that's just a brilliant way to end, actually, and I don't need to say anything else.
You sure? Because I'm still I'm gonna close, so you're welcome to.
I was just going to acknowledge the leading role that religious institutions have been playing in divestment.
Absolutely.
And in removing religious funds from climate harming industries.
Yeah, and I might just add too, in Christianity, there's grassroots movements like Arosha, where creation care has become a more part of the whole of life that we live here in terms of creation care. So yeah, I think Christianity's been guilty of consumption and following that kind of approach, but there's a grassroots movement around working with the environment. So I'm involved in a couple of environmental groups, restoring bush, native bush, because that's my contribution, working together to care for the earth.
Beautiful. Thank you. And so I will just say, if there are any clergy people on the call who are interested in doing this work and partnering with me and the Religious Diversity Center, please do be in touch. And if you are a member of a faith community and would like to make sure that your community is motivated, you can speak to your pastor, your rabbi, your priest, and do the same and have them join with us, so that together we are capable of far more than we are individually, as we have seen tonight. And so let me thank Rob and Jim and Alex for sharing your expertise with us, for hearing the call to participate. And please know that well over 200 people got to hear your wisdom and your insight tonight, and we are grateful to you for that. Thank you to Jono, our technician from Edwards, for making it all happen smoothly. We deeply appreciate it. To Richard, to Jocelyn, and to Paul of the Religious Diversity Center, thank you for convening tonight. So I'd like to conclude and invite you to direct your energy with me. Some people use the word prayer for what I'm about to do. I am going to call upon Makor HaChaim, the source of life itself. We do not know your name, and yet you course through our very veins, and you fill our lungs moment after moment. You bind us to the destiny of all other creatures on this earth, flora and fauna, a richness of diversity that our human minds cannot begin to comprehend. You have generated such profound wisdom and imbued each and every one of us creatures with it, giving to us human beings an extraordinary capacity, not only for destruction, but also for creation and for wisdom. Makor HaChaim, help us be Shomrei HaAdamah, guardians, protectors of this earth, to use our faculties to reverse the damages that we have done, and to work together to build a better world, a healthier world for all of its inhabitants. And if you wish to join me, you can say Amen. Thank you all so much for spending this evening together. It's been a real honor. Good night.